We start in Germany, where a former colonel from President Assad's regime in Syria has been found guilty of crimes against humanity. Anwar Raslan, who had claimed asylum in Germany, was convicted of mass torture, murder and abuse carried out when anti-government protests were crushed in Syria in 2011. Live now to the courthouse in Koblenz, we can join the BBC's Jenny Hill, who is there. Jenny, a landmark case on so many fronts.
Absolutely. You know, in the words of one survivor, one lawyer here, this is victory. The witnesses, the survivors, the campaigners here are thrilled with this verdict. And this verdict really matters. First of all, of course, it's justice for the families of those whose loved ones died in detention. You can probably see a few of them standing there behind me. For those who survived brutal torture. But it's also about the fact that a criminal court has formally acknowledged that the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad committed crimes against humanity against its own people. Those who oppose the Syrian president paid a terrible price. Bashar al-Assad's regime violently crushed street protests in 2011. Civilians were rounded up, detained, tortured and killed.
Yeah. It's like hell, really.
Wasim was incarcerated, interrogated in the notorious Al-Khatib prison in Damascus.
He told me directly, lay on your stomach and raise your feet in the air, so in the stress position. And I should answer the questions, and whenever the answers he didn't like the answers I gave, he ordered somebody next to me to start to hit me.
German lawyers fought hard for this trial, prompted by Syrian survivors who'd fled to Germany. They told terrible stories, torturers using special tools, electric shocks, rape, crimes so serious they could be tried outside Syria in a German court. This is a landmark case, and of course it's about justice being done, but it's also about gathering a body of evidence for the future and giving a voice to those the Assad regime wanted to silence.
Jenny, give us a little bit more of the reaction outside the courthouse.
Yeah, it's still rather muted because actually a lot of people are still inside listening to the judge read out the reasoning behind today's verdict. That could take some time. It's very important, though, to survivors here that that judgment is read out loud, because it, in effect, this whole case, in effect, forms now a body of formalised evidence which can be used in future trials. And there will be future trials. Already a number of similar cases pending in Germany, elsewhere, perhaps in Europe. But a lot of the people here are saying, look, what we really want is to look at this as a first step. We want justice to be brought to those right up the chain of command, as far as President Assad himself.
Jenny, thanks so much for joining us. Well, let's remind you now of what is happening in Syria. The war began in 2011 after a brutal crackdown on people protesting against the regime of President Assad. The violence spiralling into 10 years of civil war that's killed at least 350,000 people, according to the UN. Thousands more have been tortured or killed in custody, according to a UN report in 2021, detailing alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. Violence in the country has subsided, but the economic situation in all parts of Syria is dire, with an estimated 80% of the population living in poverty. Well, let's go live now to Amman in neighbouring Jordan and speak to Sarah Kayali, who is a senior Syria researcher from Human Rights Watch. Sarah, good to see you. Your reaction to this verdict that we've seen in Germany today?
This is truly a watershed moment, not just for Syria and Syrians, but also for the international community. This is the first trial of its kind, and the verdict really sends out a very strong message to Syrian authorities after a decade of unparalleled atrocities that justice will reach them and that they cannot escape it. We're quite hopeful that this verdict is going to be the start of many against high-level Syrian officials who have committed atrocities against their own citizens.
Sarah, so many survivors have worked so hard to get to this point today, and we've been hearing some of the reaction from Jenny Hill, our correspondent in Germany. What sort of things have they been telling you? What do you know about how they're feeling today?
Many of the survivors who testified at the trial were also people that I had interviewed for my work at Human Rights Watch. And it was very clear to us, their reaction to the verdict, they're very happy about it. They're satisfied that after 10 years, they can actually finally face their jailers, their torturers in court, and hope that this is going to be an example for the rest. But I think one important thing to note is that for many Syrians, accountability doesn't start and end in European courts. For them, an important part of justice and accountability is ensuring that the atrocities that are committed today by the Syrian authorities and other parties to the conflict are stopped. That people who had been disappeared, who are detained, whose fate we have no idea about, are also found and returned to their families and loved ones. And only then can we truly say that comprehensive justice has been achieved.
Sarah, how much do we know about what is actually happening inside Syria at the moment when it comes to forced disappearances, to torture, to what is happening in the prisons there?
I mean, what Human Rights Watch has documented makes clear that these types of atrocities that we saw being presented in the Koblenz trial are still happening to this day, including to Syrian refugees who are returning, who choose to return to Syria, end up being disappeared, they end up being detained, they end up being tortured. There are people who are being raped, sexually violated. Atrocities are continuing today in areas that are held by the government, in areas that are held by anti-government groups. In ways that we saw in 2011, 2012.
Sarah, there is this principle of universal justice that has been used in this trial. Do you hope, or do we know if this means we will see other such cases taken up by other countries?
That is exactly the hope. Germany was able to pursue this case through its adoption of the principle of universal jurisdiction, which allows them to prosecute crimes against humanity and high-level atrocities without necessarily those violations having been committed on the country's territory or by individuals, German individuals, or German victims. And so the idea is, and the hope is, and this is what we're working towards, is that other European countries adopt universal jurisdiction, put laws in place, and pursue similar cases against Syrians who have committed abuses.
Sarah, really good to get your thoughts. Thank you very much for joining us from Amman.
Thank you very much.